my coworker, Pete Nietzsche.
You know what, Michelle, I'm sorry, can I interrupt you? It
Sure.
didn't actually start recording. Could you just,
Okay.
so we'll miss the introductions, but if you could just back up.
Been there, done that. So thanks, Sal. Okay, tell me when.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Sal. So tonight we're going to talk about home vegetable gardening. And like Sal said, I work primarily with the commercial agricultural industry on vegetable production issues. I want to thank my coworker, Pete Nietzsche from Morris County with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Pete is also a vegetable expert and will be help answering the chat questions. So if you have any during the presentation, please add the question in the chat room, and Pete will happily answer those for you. At the end of the presentation, we will have a polling questions at the end. Hopefully, those of you who got on early were able to answer the poll. The question was, what's your experience level with vegetable gardening? And I was happy to see that many of you are vegetable gardening currently and have some experience. So hopefully you'll learn something, but also we'll just brush up on some things that we've taught. So the title was for gardening for food, fun, and stress relief. So I have to admit, for many, many years, the primary role of vegetable gardening for me and my family has been to garden for food. So every year we can our own vegetables, freeze our own vegetables, and I'm not going to teach you how to do that tonight. However, we do have an excellent resource with Rutgers Cooperative Extension through the Family and Community Health Sciences program. They have a website that teaches you home food preservation, as well as contacting your local Rutgers Cooperative Extension office and asking for the Family and Community Health Sciences personnel to help you find more information about this. So gardening for fun also. This is something we do on an annual basis at my household. My husband and my two sons, we can tomatoes every year. I have to admit our garden isn't large enough to produce the amount of tomatoes that we use for tomato sauce canning. However, we do get a few. Luckily, we live in southern New Jersey close to very large farms that produce tomatoes, and we purchase them every year to can and have a really fun day. When the boys were little, they thought it was a lot of fun, and as they've gotten older, they've had other interests, but still, it's a family tradition that we keep, and to me, it's fun because I think they'll enjoy the memories. So I have to admit, these are a lot of my family photos. The top photo is my son, Benjamin, who's now 18, and the bottom is my father and my younger son, Dominic. And they really did find it fun when they were little, playing in the dirt. There was really no need for a sandbox because the garden was their sandbox. So for children, hands-on activities in the garden really will help with learning. And also this time of stress, you can also reinforce with them that it may be building a sense of security, knowing that they're growing their own food and that they have somewhere to go and play. Really in the garden too, one of the neat things is you can do learning concepts, especially with young children. You can teach them to measure when you're planting the plants, to have different spacings, do addition and subtraction when you're counting out seeds or picking vegetables. Also organization. Maybe you want to sort your vegetables into different colors, shapes, or sizes. And especially for really young children, just teaching them colors really is a neat thing to do in the garden. The other nice thing is teaching them motor skills. Now, you really don't want to have very young children handling knives or pruning shears, but there's other things they can do, pulling weeds, for example. The other thing is it's teaching them a work ethic. And a lot of our examples have shown that children who garden and plant their own vegetables tend to eat more of those vegetables. So if there's broccoli in the garden and put it on the plate, they remember they helped grow that, and maybe they're more excited about eating it rather than just popping frozen microwave broccoli and putting it on their plate. The other thing is gardening has been a physical activity, and all physical activities are known to provide stress relief. I know myself, after being in the office all day or being inside a building all day, when I get home, one of the first things I want to do is go out and look in my garden and do some physical activity. Not that the physical activity is that much where you get a lot of cardio, but you do get some movement, and more importantly, you're out in the sunshine and fresh air. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of gardening. First step to gardening is what we all try to say in our extension offices when someone calls about what to grow. The first thing is don't guess, get a soil test. Fortunately, our soil test lab at Rutgers is still operating. They're operating remotely in a mail-in status only. However, that's the way we usually send soil test kits up to the university. So if you go on the website, njaes.rutgers.edu, and click for the soil testing lab, or simply just Google Rutgers Soil Testing Lab, you'll find information on how to take a soil test. You can download the form to fill out to mail in with your soil sample, and that will result in the test being done on campus, and an email recommendations sheet will be mailed to you, generally in 2 to 3 weeks when we're having non-COVID related situations. Right now it might be a little bit behind. However, it's a really good idea to get a soil test. One thing that's done in the soil test, the first thing actually, is to look at your soil pH. And you might not understand why that's so important, but I want to show you real quickly why soil pH is so important. So looking at the bottom of this chart, 4.0 is the more acidic end of the chart, whereas if you go to the other end on the right, 10.0, that's a very basic or very strongly alkaline situation. For most of our plants, the range that we want to have the soil pH is around 6.5. If you look at the bars with all the plant nutrients that a plant would need, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and so on, the most availability of those nutrients that plants need is within the 6.5 range. That's why we try to adjust most of our soils to a pH of 6.5. Because of the chemistry interactions with the soil and the nutrients that the plant needs, that's when they're most available. The next thing after you have your soil and site picked out is to make sure you're first looking at sunlight and sun exposure. Most vegetables need a minimum, and when I say minimum, no less than 6 hours of direct sunlight each day. However, 8 to 10 hours of direct sunlight is ideal. So the more sun exposure in your yard where you're going to plant vegetables, the better. That's because a lot of our vegetables we're planting come from areas or originate in areas with lots of sunlight. So it's important to have that native environment as close to as possible when we're growing vegetables. Next thing you should think about is how you're going to water your garden and which water sources you're going to need. When gardening or planting in containers, if you don't have adequate soil in your yard, that's an easy way to make sure that you're close to a water source, as long as there's enough sunlight for those gardening containers. However, if you're going to have a garden away from the house, you need to be able to easily get hoses or buckets or other ways of watering the garden. One thing we do want to be careful about, though, is I know it's very popular to use rain barrels and to have recaptured or recycled water for watering plants in our yard. However, you have to be really careful when watering vegetables. And it's often discouraged due to some pathogens that might be present from maybe bird droppings or other contaminants that may have been on the roof when you recaptured the water. And especially for vegetables we're going to eat raw, we just want to be very careful not using recaptured water for things we're going to eat. Watering your garden during morning hours is very, very important because the foliage, if it remains wet throughout the night, will continue to stay wet and not dry quickly. When that happens, we can have plant diseases like fungus and bacteria that may harm plants. So to prevent plant diseases, it's best to water at night, not at night, water first thing in the morning. Next thing we want to talk about is your garden soil quality. We already talked about taking a soil test and checking for pH, but also the soil texture is important. Vegetables do prefer a well-drained soil that doesn't puddle after heavy rains. Soils are not well suited for growing vegetables. They can also be amended with using composts. If the soil is unacceptable altogether, you might want to decide to create a raised garden and bring topsoil in. That's a good alternative. Also choose areas where soil is free of any potential contaminants, those that might be near sidewalks or roadways, things that maybe have ice melts or treatments where the water may run off and get into your garden areas. The other thing is consider the proximity to your residence. If you have a garden near the home, it'll encourage you more time for caring for the garden. More weeds will get pulled, more vegetables will be harvested, and the plants will be watered more often because you see them. The other thing is if you have young children that want to participate in the garden, and you need to run into the house for a moment, you at least can have an eye shot of that child if they're playing in the garden or working there. The other thing that's very important that we found to work best is to have some kind of wildlife or pet exclusion. Fences really work best to keep things like deer out, rabbits, or other animals. And the size of the fence really depends on the size of the animals. The top right picture is a 3-foot fence that's made of chicken wire. The bottom picture is a 6-foot fence that has a little bit larger holes, and this is my same garden in my yard. The lower fence is now what we call beagle size because we have a dog that's a beagle. The other size fence was for our yellow lab. The yellow lab would have easily jumped over the fence, and she was a big fan of tomatoes. In fact, she always got the first ripe tomato every season. However, now we have a beagle, so we have the lower fence. So be careful to pick which fence is necessary for you, depending on which wildlife you're trying to keep out of the garden. Some other considerations is choose an area with little foot traffic. Also, your soil should be free of tree roots, especially live tree roots. Avoid compacted areas, and also obtain proper tools before you start gardening so you're ready when you need to do things in the garden. Really, really important though to make sure you're not near a large tree, number one, for shade, but also roots that can grow into the garden and be an impediment to what you're trying to do. So next that you found a site that's got water sources, it's close to the house enough that you can get to it, and that you have the soil picked out and tested, you now want to start the preparation for the garden bed. So you should turn the soil over at least 8 to 12 inches deep, because that's the root depth that a lot of the vegetable plants will need to grow. You want to rake out stones and clumps of grass, and the clumps of grass could be put in the compost pile. Level the soil in the garden, and then you want to apply a small amount of complete fertilizer that contains nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You want to evenly spread this through the garden and rake it in until into the soil. You should always see your soil test reports for rates and recommendations of what you want to put into the garden for fertilizer before you start. One note I want to say is, if the fertilizer is left on top of the soil surface, a lot of times the nitrogen will be lost to volatilization. So for that reason, it's best to incorporate the fertilizer into the soil with a rake or hoe, anything that will help seal the fertilizer into the soil and not have the nitrogen volatilize. So next that you have the soil tilled and everything's ready to go, which vegetables do you want to grow? Well, there's some considerations for that. Number one is personal preference. I'll also go over some space requirements, your planting zone and climate, pest resistance and tolerance, and also the season in which you're planting. Another thing I wanted to note is Rutgers has an excellent mail-order vegetable seed source for the New Jersey Gardener fact sheet. This was recently updated, and you can find this on our website. There's a URL here, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll also give you the URL for all of our publications at Rutgers. So looking for online seed sources may be one of the best options right now. It'll help with social distancing, as well as you may get a better variety by looking online versus going into a garden center that might carry a small line of vegetables. One thing, if you're ordering online right now, though, is to be careful to see if they're going to be able to ship it quickly, as some companies are backlogged or maybe closed or having a small staff right now. One thing about seeds is the quality is very important. Seeds might be viable for a few years, but for best results, it's important to purchase new seeds each year to get the best possible results. So think about the timing of when you're going to plant. In early spring, there's many things that you can plant that'll bring late spring harvest. Some of our first harvested vegetables in the garden. Things such as leafy greens, kale, lettuce, spinach, maybe broccoli, radishes, peas, and others. One of the earliest planted vegetables in our gardens could be onions and white potatoes. However, they're not generally ready to be harvested in late spring. You'll have to wait until summer or even late summer for these harvests for them to mature. In mid-spring, there are some plantings that are done for summer harvest. Things like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, squash, cucumbers, melons, and others. These need to be made sure to be planted after the threat of springtime frosts. This year it's been kind of difficult because the weather's been so unpredictable and cold. Consider perennials also in your vegetable garden. Even though strawberries are considered a fruit, they are grown similarly to what vegetables are grown, and also asparagus. Once these are established, they can be perennial food plants that can provide years of great harvests. So now that you've decided what you want to grow in your garden, let's think about setting up the garden and how we're going to orient the rows to prevent shade and competition. You want to be sure that the direction of sunlight that's coming into the garden will help to have the most productivity for the vegetables growing. If you happen to plant the tallest vegetables on the side where the sunlight is coming from, it might shade out some of the lower growing vegetables. So be careful to think about orientation of vegetables when you're planting. The other thing that can help with spacing and setting up the garden is the use of trellises, stakes, cages, and other things to help the vegetables grow upright to save space in a small garden. This was actually my garden 2 years ago. So with personal preference, if you don't like something, maybe it's not the best thing to plant. If you don't like lima beans, don't plant them. I happen to like lima beans, so we have planted them on occasion. The other thing is you want to choose a crop that your effort level is going to be what you intend it to be. So maybe you're not into staking or trellising or spending a lot of time tying up vegetables. So those that need that effort level maybe isn't something you want to grow. The other thing is if you have very small limited space, maybe decide to grow things that are hard to find in the marketplace that are things that you must have, things that you really love but just don't have access to. With space, it's really important to make sure you realize the potential growth of certain crops. If you look at the top right there, that's a tray of small pepper transplants. The bottom, though, is a jalapeno pepper plant that grows to full size, and it may be 4 feet in diameter once it's done. So planting these small transplants very close together isn't a good idea. You have to realize the end size of the plant after it's fully grown. To find out spacing requirements, a lot of seed packets or transplant tags will have directions a lot of times on the back. So for example, if you have a very small garden, maybe it's 10 feet by 20 feet, you don't want to grow pumpkins because they can grow up to 10, 15 feet long, and that's just not a good idea to have your garden full of pumpkin vine. So the other thing to consider is your planting zone or the climate in which you're going to be planting. Luckily, again, a lot of this information is found in the seed packet. The other thing is to really understand the length of time it takes for a vegetable to come into harvest. For instance, this is really important when we're planting in the summertime for a fall harvest to make sure the plant will come to maturity before the end of the season when frost can occur. You can sometimes offset the season with season extending structures, with covers or things that will help protect plants from frost in the fall especially. However, if you don't want to put that effort in, make sure you're definitely planting in a time period when you can harvest. Luckily in New Jersey, we can grow most all vegetables because of our climate. Some tricks of the trade that farmers use to help extend the season or just for cultural management of vegetable crops are things that protect plants from weather. So the example that farmers may use is floating row covers that they'll put over their plants early in the springtime so that we can have frost protection, cold protection, and also get that crop earlier in the summer. However, it's expensive and there's a lot of work and effort put into it. So maybe in our home gardens, we want to recycle old milk jugs where you can cut the bottoms out and place them over top of a plant. The nice thing with the milk jug is you can unscrew the top to help vent those milk jugs that can become very hot in the daytime with the sunlight. Even though cold temperatures outside or in the environment, sometimes underneath that milk jug, it can heat up very quickly. So during the daytime hours, you'd want to unscrew that cap to let the heat out. The other thing farmers do is use plastic mulch to plant into. There's many benefits of plastic mulch to keep weeds down, to help keep moisture in the soil, and also to heat up the soil very early in the spring so we can get crops sooner. However, the large rolls of plastic mulch that farmers buy would not work really well for a home garden. So something that works very well is just to use black plastic trash bags that you can cut up and make sections to put in your garden. That's a simple and easy way. Another really good idea is to use the disposable plastic tablecloths that you can buy at something like a dollar store. They work very well too, and they actually come in multiple colors. However, black will actually help heat the soil. The other thing that you can use is clear plastic, which actually will heat the soil much quicker, but often doesn't help in weed control. Another trick of the trade farmers will use is staking tomatoes and other plants, like peppers. So whether or not you want to use that same staking system in your garden, you certainly can. But then the other alternative for a lot of home gardeners use is trellising, or using tomato cages, like the bottom right there. One thing that, this is a tomato plant from my father's garden that he does, is he also uses stakes to help hold down the tomato cage so it doesn't tip over when the plants get very large, or when windstorms come when the plants get taller. It'll help just to brace that tomato cage in place. Another thing we want to do when choosing vegetables for the garden is look at the pest resistance or tolerance of different varieties. The other thing is that growing seasons can influence pest pressure. In the springtime, there's some pests that come out during the cool temperatures that we deal with, but on the whole, a lot more pests, especially insect pests and diseases, are prevalent in the late summer months when we have more of a flush of, and actually the insects are just abundant that time of year because of the warm temperatures mainly. So cultural practices are also a way to grow plants that contribute to pest tolerance. Staking or using raised beds to keep the water from puddling around plants is a good idea to stop diseases. Also, some varieties have tolerance to diseases and even some insect pests. These attributes are generally listed in the seed catalogs or on seed packets. Here's an example of a tomato variety I found that says ultrasonic, which is the variety, but then it says VFT. So it has verticillium and fusarium tolerance. There usually is a code in the catalog that tells you what the acronym VFT means. So look for the letters and look for disease-resistant varieties. This way they won't have issues, and also you won't have to spray as much if you want to put pesticides on. Some people choose to do that to help deter pests and diseases, but sometimes you can get away with not having to put pesticides on by finding varieties that are pest resistant. Let's get into some of the crops now. I'm going to start off first with cool season crops, such as radishes, onion, garlic, beets, white potato, turnips, and carrots. I highlighted white potato because I'm going to go over that in more detail. But generally in spring, some of the first things we can plant are our root crop vegetables. So for white potato is a cool season vegetable that really ranks with wheat, rice, and rice as one of the most important staple crops in all the human diet around the world. Many of you know about the Irish potato famine, and that occurred predominantly because that was the major food source of the Irish during that time. I won't get into a lot of historical details about that, but it's just showing how potatoes are such an important crop. One thing that's often confused with potatoes is they are not roots. Some people think they're roots. They actually are specialized underground storage systems that are called tubers. Maximum tuber formation occurs when the soil temperature is between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is why potatoes are amongst the earliest to be planted in the springtime. Once the soil temperature reaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which it often can in the summertime, the tubers fail to form. So we want to make sure tuber formation occurs during our cooler soil temperatures. So how do you plant white potatoes, and where do you get white potato seed pieces? So potatoes aren't started from seeds like other vegetables. They actually are, we use what we call our clones or seed pieces. Simply, we just take a potato, we cut it up, making sure there's at least 2 to 3 good eyes, or 1 good eye if you see it sprouting. I really like to make sure there's at least 2 to 3 eyes when I'm planting. How do you know if there's a good sprout or a good eye on a piece of potato? Well, in your pantry, sometimes you'll start seeing the potatoes sprout. So once you see a potato starting to sprout, that's definitely one that'll do well in the garden. You want to plant the seed pieces about 10 to 12 inches apart in a row. And before you plant them, you want to make a furrow that's about 2 to 3 inches deep. And then set the potatoes down the row, making sure the eye side is upward. So on the left-hand side, you see my furrow where I planted my potatoes this spring. And then about 3 weeks later on the right-hand side, you see the sprouts coming up. There's still a little bit of that furrow there because I'm going to tell you what you need to do next. When the sprout breaks the surface, as they start growing taller, you're going to gradually bring soil towards that ridge and pulling up near the base of the plants with a hoe. Eventually, this ridge may become 4 to 6 inches high throughout the summer. You want to do that because tubers that start to form near the base of the plant that aren't covered with soil can become green. Have you ever left a potato out in the sunlight or on the counter and it turns green? When you start to peel it, you'll see it under the skin. Well, that can happen with a potato that's growing if the tuber isn't completely covered by soil. That's why you want to mound up the soil around the base of the plant. The other thing with tubers when they're developing underground is you want to make sure you have a uniform moisture in the soil. We don't want to overwater plants because it can cause root rot and damage, but you want to make sure they're watered adequately. When it's time to harvest the potatoes, you'll know this when the plant's ready, when the vines start to die and yellow. You want to be careful to use a shovel or a pitchfork to lift the potatoes out of the soil, but be careful not to cut or stab the tubers. So to do this, you start digging deeply about 8 to 12 inches away from the stem and work inwards very carefully until you exhume the potatoes underground. If you go very deeply, you can lift up full shovels of soil and then turn it over to expose the tubers. When we talked about gardening for fun, this is probably the most fun thing my children liked to do when they were little, is go out and hunt for potatoes underground. So that could be a really nice project if you have young children in the garden. Our next cool season crops we're going to talk about is our leafy crops. Things of spinach, lettuce, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, different kinds of greens, even celery and Swiss chard. So on the right-hand side, my son actually 2 weeks ago was planting our romaine lettuce in the garden. And then below that, in late March, we actually seeded Swiss chard that was just starting to come up and start making small plants. I'm going to go over lettuce because that's one that's fairly popular with many home gardeners. Lettuce is not freeze tolerant, but it is fairly hardy and cool tolerant. It thrives usually when the average daily temperatures are between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the temperatures get above that, lettuce does not do very well, and it can do something which is called bolting, where a seed head will start coming up out of the center. So that's why we don't usually grow lettuce in the summertime when it's hot. However, we plant lettuce early in the spring, and then also again in late summer we can plant seed out in the garden or small transplants that'll be ready for fall harvest. Generally the first week of August in New Jersey is when we would plant these lettuce plants for fall harvest. We really don't want hot temperatures of June or July to have lettuce growing for harvest. It'll often be bitter and it'll produce seed stalks that form rapidly. Some types and varieties of lettuce do withstand heat better than others, and a lot of times the seed packet or the plant catalog will help to determine which ones do better during the heat of summer. Fall harvested lettuce will have more pests, as we indicated before, because pests are just more prevalent in the fall months. So with lettuces, there's so many different types of lettuces that you could choose for your garden. Really, personal preference and what you like is important. The one thing I will warn about with lettuces, though, rabbits love lettuce. So if you're going to grow that in your garden, be sure to have some kind of rabbit-proof fence, such as chicken wire, and make sure there's no holes in the fence or anywhere they could burrow underneath. Keep it tight when you're putting a fence up for lettuce. Take care of your lettuce once it's growing in the garden. You have to realize that lettuce has shallow root systems. So when you disturb the soil near the surface, you may damage the lettuce roots and also hurt the plant. So be careful if you're using implements like a hoe to remove weeds around the base of the lettuce plant. And again, since the roots are shallow, it may need watering more often. Lettuce is usually not a deep-rooted crop that'll forage roots deep into the soil to get moisture, so you may need to water more often. Just be careful, though, again, not to overwater, because if the soil is kept too wet, it can lead to disease infections and harm plants. How do you harvest and when do you harvest lettuce? Well, many lettuces can be cut whenever you feel they're large enough to use. The other thing is you can cut the larger outer leaves and leave the center of the plant to continue growing. Cutting every other plant that you have in a row also gives a good way of having more space for the plants next to the plant you cut to keep growing. Different types of lettuces take different days to harvest. Typically, a lot of our leaf lettuce varieties take about 50 to 60 days to reach maximum size to harvest. Butterhead varieties form loose heads in about 60 to 70 days, and romaine varieties are again about 70 days and have upright growth and have a plant habit that will make them have medium dense heads. One of the lettuces that's a bit different than our looser leaf lettuces is the iceberg lettuce. This really can be harvested whenever heads are firm, and different varieties will result in different size heads, as well as growing conditions will affect the size of all of the lettuces. Moving next to another cool season crop is our beans or our legumes. Things like peas, fava beans, snap beans, lima beans, black-eyed peas, and there's probably about 30 different types of beans if you start looking. The thing is to be careful to make sure to know which ones are very cold tolerant. Really, peas and fava beans are the only ones that are cold tolerant and can be planted in mid-March. After that, most of the other beans need to wait until the soil temperatures reach at least 50 degrees to germinate properly and to grow steadily. I'm going to give you an example of snap beans. This is something that's popular in home gardens. But you want to be careful when you're picking a snap bean variety to plant, which one you want to grow. When I say which one, I don't mean which variety, I mean which growth habit you want to choose. There's many different varieties that are considered what we call bush beans. They stand erect and do not need support. They will yield well and require less work because you don't need to tie them up or trellis them. Green bush beans were formerly called string beans, if many people recall, because there was a fiber that developed along the seams of the pod. However, plant breeders have reduced the fibers and have selected for more tender varieties. So now we really refer to green beans as snap beans instead of string beans. If you choose to grow pole beans, you'll need to have something that they can climb and support to help them be easily harvested. Otherwise, the vines will just lay on the ground and the beans will lay on the ground and most likely rot or become soiled. So make sure if you're picking a pole bean type variety that you have some kind of support like strings or a fence or something that you can tie them up to. One thing about snap beans is they're very cold sensitive and they are also not frost tolerant. So they should be planted after the danger of frost is passed in the spring. In New Jersey, our frost-free date is May 15th. So how do you plant beans? Well, all seeds of beans should be planted to a depth of about 1 inch. You want to plant seeds of bush beans about 2 to 3 inches apart within the row and at least 18 to 24 inches apart between rows. Again, you want to plant the pole beans a little bit further apart because they are going to be larger plants that will need to be spaced further apart than what you would for your bush beans. The thing about most beans is most varieties tend to crack and germinate poorly if the soil moisture content is too high. It'll split the bean open. If you think about it, have you ever taken a dry bean and boiled it in a pot and the seed will split? Well, that also happens to bean seeds that are planted where the water is too much in the soil. So for this reason, you should never soak the bean seed before planting. I've heard that by some gardeners thinking that'll help increase germination, but instead it really just cracks the bean, and then the small plantlet that's inside that'll germinate is usually destroyed. So instead, after you plant the seed, just let it sit in the soil and water it if there's no rain. However, if there's a heavy rain, that'll be adequate enough water to start the germination process. So once snap beans are ready to be harvested, how do you know when they're ready? Well, usually when they're firm and crisp and fully elongated, but you want to pick them before the seeds within the pod develop and become hard. You want to pick the beans after the plants are thoroughly dry in the daytime, because if you pick them when they're wet, you can spread plant diseases if there are any present. That's true with any vegetable. You really want to make sure you're harvesting when they're dry, so not first thing in the morning. The other thing we want to be careful with beans, any kind of beans for that matter, is you want to be careful not to break the stems or branches. Most of the branches on beans are brittle, so it might be a good idea to actually hold the stem before you start pulling on the bean so you don't break the stem. We want to continually harvest the beans off of the stems, because the more we pull the beans off, the more flowers we'll produce and more pods will continue to mature, and we'll have more and more beans throughout the garden. And that's another good idea why we don't want to break the stems, to continue having that continual harvest of stems that are staying there and producing more flowers. Next, we want to get into our warm season vegetables, and these are really a lot of the popular vegetables that are in our home gardens or that people like to grow. Things like cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, squashes, melons, and sweet potato. Notice I skipped corn. Corn is something I generally go into great detail when I do a longer version of this talk, but trust me, corn is not a great vegetable to plant in the home garden. It's very difficult based on the way that the pollen has to fall onto the silks of each individual ear of corn as it's growing to pollinate those ears. And in a home garden, it's really almost impossible to have enough space so that you have multiple rows for the pollen to fall on the ear of corn. That's all I'm going to say about corn. I would just say get the corn from your local farmer's market or your local roadside stand. They do a much better job and have a larger space for the pollen to pollinate each individual kernel of corn that needs to be grown. So we'll move on to some popular warm season vegetables next. Tomatoes. I bet everyone who has a vegetable garden plants tomatoes. It's the most popular garden vegetable in America. One of the reasons is the quality of fruit that we can pick from the garden from a fully ripe tomato far surpasses anything available in the market, since we can pick our tomatoes at the maximum ripeness. Tomato plant is a tender warm season perennial that's grown as an annual in most of our summer gardens because of our climate. Spring and fall freezes limit the outdoor growing season for tomatoes. But tomatoes are such a difference in variety, and we have so many to choose from. Make sure you pick one that's suitable for what you want. The other important thing when you're choosing a variety is to see if the variety is what we call determinate or indeterminate. Most of our home garden varieties we select are the latter, the indeterminate varieties. What do those two terms mean? Quite frankly, it's just a simple thing to realize. A determinate variety is a variety that's going to stop at a determined amount of height. An indeterminate variety is one that's going to continually keep growing and growing taller and taller. So based on which one you want to deal with or tackle in your garden is which one you're going to pick. Here's a field research trial we did at Rutgers many years ago to look at determinate and indeterminate tomato varieties. One thing to note in the field is the different height in the stakes we use to tie up the tomatoes. If you notice, there's some smaller stakes that had the indeterminate tomato and the taller stakes that the indeterminate tomato, the determinant of the smaller stakes. the indeterminate tomatoes topped out and actually went taller than the stakes that were in the field. And they were 8-foot stakes. So again, just knowing which materials you're going to need to grow which tomatoes is important. And if you're not using stakes, then looking at wired cages or other structures to help hold them up is important to know how tall the tomato may grow. Let's talk a little bit about determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. So on the bottom left is a field of what we call determinate tomatoes that farmers grow in their field. The one thing I like about determinate varieties of tomatoes is they happen to have what we call a concentrated set of fruit, where they come on mostly all at once and we have a lot of fruit on a single plant. On the right-hand side, we have the Ramapo tomato that Rutgers helps to provide and sell through our communications office. But it's a variety that we had years ago that commercial farmers did grow, but as our more hybrid and determinate varieties came along, we realized we can get the same, if not more, production off of a smaller plant. So it depends on what you really want to grow, whether if you want to grow a new hybrid variety, or a lot of us as home gardeners like to stick with some of the old, reliable, and flavorful, what we call heirloom varieties, which I would say nowadays Ramapo is probably an heirloom variety. And actually, when we talk about Ramapo, it's probably more of a semi-determinate and not so much an indeterminate, because it does not get as
All right, folks, hold on while we try to get Michelle's audio back. Michelle, I'm sorry, we lost your audio. Nope, we still can't hear you. Nope.
Michelle?
Oh yeah, now we can.
Okay, I'm going to do it without headsets. I'm not sure if that makes a difference. Are you ready to go?
Yep.
Yeah, you sound fine.
Thanks a lot, Sal. Okay, so planting tomatoes. Was that where we left off, or should I go to the last slide?
Maybe go back one.
How's that?
Good.
Thank you. So I talked about determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. So determinate tomatoes, again, are tomatoes that are going to reach a determined amount of size and height. I really like determinate tomatoes because they actually have a concentrated set and can produce the same amount, if not more, tomatoes on a smaller plant versus our indeterminate varieties. Ramapo is a semi-determinate variety that can grow very tall. It's not as tall as some of our indeterminates like Brandywine. However, again, these take special training, and we need to have higher stakes or higher cages to fulfill the staking needs of an indeterminate plant. So when we're planting our tomatoes, some of us like to put out tomatoes a little too soon, and I have to say I'm one who does this. I think that we're going to have warm nights. I get optimistic, and I put my tomatoes out, which I did last week and then had to cover them up. So be careful to look at the weather and possibly also wait until May 15th or later when we have no more threat of frost in New Jersey. So for best results, plant when your soil is warm, soon after frost-free dates, and then just be really careful to know what the height and the space requirement is for the different varieties you're going to grow. And it really is variety determined on what spacing you're going to need to do for tomatoes. I mean, the general rule of thumb is to plant the plants 24 inches apart and 5 feet between rows. If you're going to use cage systems, you might want a little bit more room because you're going to use those cages instead of staking and tying. So also look at if you're using indeterminate plants, which can be much larger than the determinate plants, you're going to want a spacing of 24 to 36 inches apart in the row and 5 to 6 feet between rows. Again, just larger plants, larger spacing. When you have the tomatoes planted or at planting, you may want to use what we call a starter fertilizer. And this is really as directed. There's some information on that. The one thing we do want to be really careful with tomatoes especially is not to over-fertilize. I could probably count over the years many gardeners who have come to our office and said, I have beautiful, large, green, lush tomato plants with no tomatoes. That's generally indicative of the fact that too much nitrogen fertilizer has been put on the plant, and the plant stays in what we call a vegetative phase, producing many leaves and vines, but it hinders the plant from producing any flowers and fruit, which is really the end result and what we want. So you want to plant plants that receive sufficient water also, because if you don't have sufficient water, we'll have things such as blossom drop, and there won't be fruit that are large enough or that enlarge during its growth. The other thing that's a problem is fruit may have something called blossom end rot, and this is due to a calcium deficiency. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about disorders at the end of this presentation. The other thing is if we plant tomato plants in containers, we might need more frequent watering when the plants are large, just because they don't have a large well or soil supply of water in that container. Also, you want to apply nitrogen fertilizer near the root zone after tomatoes have grown to about the size of a golf ball. And I'm talking about the round red tomatoes, not necessarily your cherry tomatoes. But you don't want to apply any more fertilizer until after fruit set. That will ensure that the tomato plants are going into a fruit mode and not staying vegetative and having too many leaves. Thereafter, throughout the whole growing season, you can also apply a little bit more nitrogen 3 weeks after the first application of when you see fruit, then maybe 6 weeks later to keep it going. Now this is going to be very dependent on your soil types. This recommendation is more for soils that are more sandy and not having a lot of organic matter. If you have heavier soils with lots of organic matter, you definitely can cut back on the fertilization of your tomatoes. The other thing you want to be careful of, after you fertilize plants, if there's no rainfall, you want to water the plants thoroughly to help the fertilizer percolate down into the soil and get to the root zone. You want to be sure also not to give fertilizer on the leaves because it could cause leaf burn. If this does happen, you want to rinse it off with water. Many gardeners train their tomato plants to stakes or trellises in cages with great success, so that is definitely encouraged. We've talked about that a few times, but I can't reiterate enough how much better your tomatoes will be other than when they're grown on the ground. Next warm season crop that's very popular is peppers. There's so many different varieties of peppers and colors, and even hot peppers that you can grow in your garden. Some that might be really hard to find in the grocery store that you may want to have in your garden. Again, these do not tolerate any frost and do not grow well in cold soils. When night temperatures are below 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the plants will grow slowly and be stunted and can possibly turn yellow because they're not uptaking nutrients very well. For peppers, you want to set transplants about 18 to 24 inches apart in the row and at least 48 inches between rows, because they're going to grow very large, and when they're small, you just don't realize how big of a plant they could be. Peppers also thrive well in well-drained soils with good fertility and with adequate moisture, especially when the peppers are starting to enlarge and get larger in size. You want to make sure there's enough water for them. You also want to use starter fertilizer just like with tomatoes when you're transplanting to help give them a good kickstart and to root well into the soil. Later on, you're going to apply supplemental fertilizer, or what we also call side dressing, after the first flush of pepper fruit are set, again similar to tomatoes. Because a uniform moisture supply is essential with peppers, you want to make sure to water the plants deeply during dry periods. And when I say deeply, what I mean is we don't want to necessarily water plants like tomatoes or peppers every day. We want to water them for longer periods of time more infrequently so that the water goes down deeply in the soil and the roots will forage for nutrients and water, also creating a good anchorage system for these plants so they don't tip over or they don't have any upheaval. So we want to be sure to get the roots to grow deeply. The one thing with peppers is hot, dry winds and dry soil conditions may prevent fruit set or cause abortion of small immature fruits or even flowers. So keeping them well watered during dry, hot periods is essential to keep good pepper growth. When you harvest peppers, really they can be harvested at any size, but it's really a good idea to make sure they're fully grown so you're getting the maximum harvest off of the plant. With bell pepper varieties, you want to make sure they're fully grown to at least a 3 to 4 inch long size, and make sure they're firm and green. Now, if you want to grow them for colored peppers, say red or purple or yellow or orange, all the different varieties we have available, you need to let them stay on the plant much longer. All colored peppers start off green, and when they ripen will turn to the color they're intended to be. When fruits are mature, they break away much easier from the plant. You want to also make sure to harvest during morning hours because the plants are full of moisture and they're not starting to wilt from the heat of the day. But you also want to make sure that the plants are dry, so harvesting early morning hours when the plants are still wet is not a good idea. It actually could help to spread any diseases that might be present in the garden. So when you move from plant to plant and you're bringing that moisture along, you don't really want to do that. It's the best, again, to let the plants be dry. And that's just not for peppers. That's for all the crops that you're harvesting in the garden. When you're picking hot peppers, you also want to have caution because it could irritate skin, nose, and eyes, especially if you touch your eyes. And you can become painfully irritated. So it's a really good idea to use plastic or rubber gloves in the garden when handling hot peppers. I want to go over a few disorders of vegetables that you may see. Some of the causes are environmental reasons. Yes.
Can I interrupt you and
Sure.
have you start the poll?
Sure.
Okay, so if you go down where the poll is, it says options.
Yep. Yep. Can you see that now?
Yep, that's good. Okay, so everyone, this poll is about 10 questions. It is going to time out after 20 minutes or so. See, a lot of people are already starting to work on it. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Sal. Good idea. That's a great idea. So I just want to go over a few disorders to wrap it up. And some of the things that we have problems with vegetables may be environmental reasons, weather-related reasons, plant nutrient deficiencies, also some issues with flowers that are pollinated by bees. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time tonight to go over all the different insect pests or disease pests we have in the garden, but I thought some of these disorders were important. One thing that we see in tomatoes is something called cat facing of tomatoes and sun scald. Now, naturally, some of the older heirloom varieties of tomatoes will have these disorders or these indents or what we call zippers or different deformities in tomatoes. Brandywine is notorious for this. However, we see these cat facing, as we call it, disorders a lot of times when we plant tomatoes too early in the spring and they have many nights of cold temperatures below 40 degrees. There's something internally that the flower bud has a defect in it, and then the first fruit that are going to be set on that plant will have this cat facing disorder. So if you see this on your first fruit that aren't supposed to have it generally for that variety, it may be because we planted too early. Another disorder we have is sun scald on tomato, and this occurs when there's not enough plant leaves or foliage to cover up the fruit as they're ripening, and the sun can burn them, especially on high intense days. Other things we see in the garden sometimes are nutrient deficiencies, and one in particular I picked out was a nitrogen deficiency. A lot of times plants will be stunted, they will be yellow, and they won't grow properly. So anytime you see a yellowing in a plant, it may be a nitrogen deficiency, especially if you haven't fertilized enough. One of the key things we see in tomatoes and other vegetables, believe it or not, even in squashes and melons, is something called blossom end rot or calcium deficiency. Calcium is absorbed by roots in an ion form with calcium with 2 positive ions. I don't want to get too technical, but what that means is the calcium must be in the water solution in order for it to be taken up by the plant. So if you see plants that have young leaves that are stunted, distorted, spotted, and necrotic on their leaf edges, you might have a calcium deficiency. Even more so, you're going to see the deficiency in the blossom end of the fruit. Here's an example of this tomato picture, and I'm sure those of you who have gardened have probably seen this before. Even if you think you're doing everything you can, this also occurs sometimes. Although you have calcium present in your soils at high levels based on your soil test, dry conditions are going to limit the uptake of calcium in a lot of circumstances. And again, because the calcium has to be taken up through a process where it's mixed with water called mass flow. Whereas the plant is taking in the water and the roots, the calcium comes along with it. So again, calcium must be in that soil water solution. High levels of sodium, potassium, and magnesium and ammonia in the soil also can cause calcium deficiency, mainly because these are also positive ions that may outcompete calcium. So I don't want to get into it too much, but here's some more pictures of blossom end rot. And this is generally what occurs when we have calcium deficiency in some of our vegetable plants. Lastly, I want to go over some pollination issues of cucurbits. This is because a lot of our vine crop plants, whether it be melons, pumpkins, cucumbers, squash, all different types of squash, need bees or some other pollinator. Native pollinators are also important, not just honeybees, to bring the pollen from the male flower to the female flower. If you notice that depiction of the squash plant on the right, I pointed out the female flower and the male flower. This is an early plant of squash that has not been harvested yet. One issue we have with zucchini and yellow summer squash is the female flower comes out about 7 days before the male flower comes out. What happens then is the pollen source is not available to be transferred by the bees into the female flower so that fertilization occurs. So generally your first few zucchini or yellow squash fruit that form are deformed and the tips aren't fully elongated or swollen like they would be on your normal fertilized or pollinated squash. A good example of that is in the top left corner with cucumbers, where the pollen source did not get to the flower, the female flower. When the pollen is brought into the female flower, it goes down into the ovaries and it also will then fertilize the embryo then becoming the seed. Seeds give off natural hormones within the fruit that help the fruit to expand and elongate and to form properly. So when not enough pollen is transferred from the male flower to the female flower, we will get this deformed looking fruit. That's why it's so important for having honeybees. And we approximate that it takes anywhere from 20 to 25 visits by a single bee to a single flower to bring enough pollen into there to make the pollination occur for these vine crops. So again, busy bees, of course, do the job for us. With that, I want to end because we do have a time commitment to finish up, and I just want to thank you. But I also wanted to reiterate that on our Rutgers webpage, njaes.rutgers.edu/pubs, our publications have a multitude of vegetable gardening fact sheets as well as other information to help you learn more about vegetable gardening that we just couldn't fit in 1 hour tonight. So I want to thank my colleague Sal for hosting, and I want to thank Pete Nietzsche for the chat questions. And at this time, if you want, we can open it up to some questions if there's time allotted. I'm not sure. Thank you, Sal.
Yeah, I think it would be fine if we took some questions. Pete, were there some that seemed generally applicable?
So there's a question I am seeing on here, Sal. How do you get more calcium to the tomatoes to prevent blossom end rot? The best way to do that is just to make sure you have adequate soil moisture. And just like I said with peppers, you want to water infrequently and deeper. So what that means is rather than watering for 10, 15 minutes a day, every day, you may want to put your sprinkler on for at least an hour or an hour and a half every third day, so that it encourages the roots to go more deeply, as well as having more soil moisture deep where the calcium may be. And that should really help with blossom end rot. Someone asked, does it really help to put an egg or Tums in the hole when transplanting tomatoes to prevent blossom end rot? That's really not true. You really want to use something like lime or even calcium nitrate as a fertilizer source. Putting Tums or an egg, the egg would have to decompose over time and release the calcium. It would take forever. It would not be readily available to that plant. And Tums, I don't really think that's an alternative. Again, it's not throughout the soil like a lime or a fertilizer product would be. So just using fertilizer would be really something you'd want to do. I'm looking through. Pete, did you answer a lot of these? I think if you have anything to add.
There was a couple questions about pruning tomatoes, so I thought you might want to.
About what tomatoes? I'm sorry.
Pruning them.
Pruning. Well, Pete's actually one of the experts on that, and that's a good question. And Pete, please jump in if you want to add to that. Most of the time, it's not necessary to prune tomatoes. However, commercially for farmers, we actually do that, especially with determinate varieties. We will actually remove 1 to 2 of the lower suckers, what we call suckers or stems that are near the base of the plant, because they're generally not fruiting stems. And to put more energy into the more above stems that will create the first fruit, we do prune those back. I know myself, when I have indeterminate plants in the garden, they just get too tall and unruly, so sometimes I will start trimming them back. But Pete, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, we talk about pruning a little bit in our tomato fact sheet. It's on our publications website there. But it kind of depends on how you want to train them and grow them. Some people prune them heavily and grow them to one stake in a cage. You don't really have to do that. Of course, if you prune, you're going to reduce the number of flowers and increase the fruit size, but you'll have more fruit if you do not prune. So it's kind of a balance of things.
Yeah, I agree with what Pete said. And the other thing is, when you prune, you're now creating a wound or an opening that also is an avenue for diseases to get into the plant. So you have to be very careful with that. And if you do determine that you need to prune, make sure you're using something very sharp, that you're not pulling or making the more wound of a wound area. Again, just causing a lot of issues with possible diseases. So anything else?
I saw a common question we get a lot from gardeners about using Epsom salts.
That's a good question. So Epsom salts are primarily magnesium. The one thing we do find is sometimes if too much calcium is applied in the soil, you can induce a magnesium deficiency in the plant. Again, because calcium is a positive 2 ion, so is magnesium is a positive 2 ion, and they can outcompete for uptake in the plant. So you can actually help to alleviate that by dissolving Epsom salts in some water and then applying it to the root zone of the plant. You want to be very careful though that it's a dilute formulation, and even in farm fields, we recommend anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds per acre. So that's a very large area. So maybe you want to start with a tablespoon in 2 gallons of water and just add a little bit at a time. But you'll notice Epsom salt can help green plants and make them become more lush. You'll see a magnesium deficiency in tomato when the bottom leaves, the oldest leaves, you'll start seeing what we call interveinal chlorosis, or yellowing of the tissue between the veins. The veins will remain green on the bottom of the plants, but the tissue between them will start yellowing. That's a good sure sign that you have magnesium deficiency, and that's when you would need to apply something like Epsom salts. There are some publications that can help you determine the amount you'll need, but again, just don't overdo it. It's better to put less than more because you can burn plants with the salts. There are commercial grade agricultural Epsom salts, but typically you actually can use the bath Epsom salts that you use to soak feed or other sores. Pete, do you have anything to add to that?
No, it'll help if your soil is deficient in magnesium. It won't really do anything if it's not.
Right. So again, don't guess, soil test, and then you'll know.
Yeah, there was a couple other questions that we commonly get about companion planting. I don't know if you want to touch on that or you want me to, Michelle?
Sure. You know what, I will, but then, if you have anything to add. So I actually am a believer in companion planting, and I didn't have photographs of it, but I like to grow eggplants in my garden, and eggplants are just a magnet for a lot of insects that come into the garden. So typically I'll use things such as marigolds to plant between the eggplants, and believe it or not, I feel it does help, because if you've ever grown marigolds in your garden, there really are no insects that like marigolds. So yeah, I think that can help, and there's different, wives' tales or even research some out there that shows that helps. And Pete, do you have any experience? I'm sure you do.
Well, my version of companion planting is to plant some flowers and herbs, flowering herbs that attract beneficial insects to the vegetable garden so that they can move on and control some of the pests. We actually have an entomologist that has done research and showed it worked in peppers, planting some flowers, cilantro, dill, things that are very attractive to beneficials, and bringing them close to peppers, and then they went ahead and controlled the worms on the peppers. So that's typically the way I look at it. More planting beneficial plants that attract beneficial insects will help a lot.
That's good, Pete. I agree. Another question is, how large should a pot be for tomatoes and peppers if you plant one per pot? Honestly, the bigger the better, and it really depends on the variety you're planting. There are varieties of tomatoes called patio tomatoes, and with those I would say at least no smaller than a 5-gallon pot. I would say that for any of them, but the larger tomatoes, if you're growing an indeterminate variety, just the larger the better. Even, I would say, believe it or not, a 10-gallon pot. Again, when you have so much top growth, and if you have such a small area for the root growth, you'll be constantly watering that plant, and it will not be as successful. So unfortunately for tomatoes and even peppers, the larger the better, but no smaller than a 5-gallon pot. And make sure your pots always have drain holes at the bottom, because you never want a situation where that plant is sitting in too much water and having oxygen deprivation from the roots, because roots need moisture, but they also need oxygen to be healthy. Pete, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that's, the bigger the pot, the better usually for tomatoes. Particularly
One thing I do grow, I'm sorry, go ahead, Pete.
Particularly if you're having problems with blossom and rot.
That's a really good point. The one thing I do plant in pots all the time, so they're close to my back door and I use them often, is my herbs. If you can get away with not planting vegetables in pots, that's great. Unfortunately, I know if you're in a situation where you don't have a yard or you don't have space in the yard for a garden, pots are maybe your only option, and they can work very well. I would say if you're planting in a pot for tomatoes or peppers, definitely get a cage where you can help them stay upright. If not, they may tumble over in the pot. Just looking through some of the chat questions. It says, I compost my food scraps. When should I apply finished compost to the vegetable garden? That really is a good time to do that in fall so that it helps to decompose, and you want to till it in. We want to be very careful when we're putting any type of organic matter or compost in the garden that it doesn't have what we call too much carbon in it. As it starts to rot away, the carbon can actually steal nitrogen away from the soil and not have it available for our plants. So you want to be careful that you're definitely using a finished compost, and also make sure what was in that compost to make sure you're not imbalancing it. We actually have had presentations on compost, and I believe there's one with this series. Am I right? Anyone?
Yeah.
Yep. And we also have wonderful fact sheets on compost, so please visit our website. Okay. Is there any other ones you see, Pete, that we need to address?
I'm trying to look through. Comment on succession planting.
That's a good question. So succession planting, this is something that really will help you have your favorite vegetables throughout the whole season. So for instance, I'll start planting my snap beans this week, and then I know that they will probably only be good through the month of July, and then after that the plants kind of die, or what we call senesce. They reach their life cycle. So if I want them to continue and have another planting, I would just plant probably about another 3 to 4 weeks after that, just knowing how long it takes from the time of seeding or planting till when they're ready, and just kind of time that out. The other thing we really love in our garden is zucchini squash. And I know once we start harvesting zucchini squash, the plants only produce well for about 4 to 5 weeks. So again, we'll plant another group of zucchini squash seeds, about a month after we plant the first ones, just so we have a continual supply of things that we really like to have out of the garden. So just looking at the days till harvest is a good way to look at that. Pete, you have anything to add?
No, I'm looking at another question here. Might be a good one. If fire pit ash is good for the soil?
So that's a good question. So fire pit ashes contain a lot of potassium. They also contain a few other things. You just want to be careful not to over-apply them into the soil. You can put them on, they don't hurt, but you also don't want to put too many, because they also can, the other thing you got to be really careful is to make sure that you haven't burned anything that contains nails or metal or staples, especially if you'd like to walk through your garden barefoot. You have to be really careful about that. But they do actually help provide some potassium to the soil. Other than that, I just wouldn't overdo it. Pete, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, they do. It does tend to drive the pH of the soil up. So when I've seen really high pH on soil tests, usually the person has applied lots of wood ashes. So apply a little bit, but don't go crazy in the same spot, or it will drive up the pH out of the optimal range.
That brings up a good point, Pete. We often get questions about, if I add my shade tree leaves to my vegetable garden, does that make the soil more acidic in the following year? And the answer to that, after much experience and also much research that we've done at Rutgers, the answer is no. When you use shade tree leaves as a compost or just applying them in your garden in the fall, it doesn't really drive up the pH, drive down the pH to make it more acidic. However, if you're using any evergreen needles or any pine tree needles, they can bring the pH down in your soil. So be careful when you're applying them as a organic matter amendment in the garden. Any others?
Here's a common one. What do I do to get rid of the little green caterpillars that eat my kale? Any good organic options?
So that's a really good question. There are some organic insecticides out there. Mostly are what we call our BTs, or Bacillus thuringiensis. You can find them in a lot of your garden centers to apply. When I grew up on our family farm years ago, though, my dad had an option where we would actually go out in the field and find egg masses or insects and pick them off. Back in the day when we had no real good options for Colorado potato beetle on eggplant, we actually used to walk the field with old coffee cans or buckets and capture the insects. So if you're willing to spend the extra time, that is one way too, is to hand pick them off. If you see egg masses, to take your thumb and your pointer finger and just squish the egg masses. So that's one way to help control them. But there are some organic options out there. Pete, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, there's probably more than likely that's imported cabbage worm, the butterfly that flies around your garden is laying the eggs. We have a fact sheet on our website. You can look that up, imported cabbage worm, if you have a problem with whole crops like kale, broccoli, cabbage. But that's probably what it is. And then we also have a fact sheet of insecticides labeled for vegetables, both organic and conventional, that you can look up there.
Good points, Pete. Yeah, we have a lot more information on that. Try to look through some more. This is great. We're getting a lot of great questions. Someone said, I've been told it's fine to use a rain barrel for watering vegetable gardens, to pour the water at the base of the plant and not the leaves, and of course, wash the food before eating. I would say it's probably okay to use a rain barrel when the plants are young. I'm just really hesitant because of all the raw things we eat. If you have any bird droppings or even squirrels that get up on rooftops that might have droppings and they wash down into the rain barrel water, it can be an issue. So it just depends on your risk-reward rating and how you want to do that. Just be very careful, that's all I would say. And I just feel it's not a great idea, especially when vegetables we eat raw. And washing your vegetables all the time is really important. I do know that myself and even young children, you tend to see a nice ripe cherry tomato out in the garden, and you just want to pick it off and eat it. So again, it's, risk-reward there. Pete, you have anything to add?
No, it's always best to wash things before you eat them and be careful about food safety. Another question here, does soap work as an insecticide?
So that's a good question. Actually, soap does work for certain insects, such as aphids or soft-bodied insects. I've actually recommended at times to take a spray bottle, and the more viscous the soap is, such as a white ivory dish soap, the better it'll work. What happens is those small soft-bodied insects, especially when they're in a nymphal or larvae form, have what's called a siphon pump that they breathe through on their exoskeleton, and you can actually clog it with using some soaps. So it does work for certain insects, but not all, and I would say things like aphids, whitefly nymphs, or things like that are just hatched out, it could help with. Pete, do you have anything to comment?
Well, I tend to steer people towards the commercial insecticidal soap formulas because there's a labeled rate, directions for the use, and it's labeled for vegetables. The problems you can get into, household soaps sometimes contain perfumes and other things that might actually damage the plant and may be less effective as an insecticide. So the commercial ones are more expensive than household soap, but I typically steer people towards those.
You're right, Pete. There are some commercial insecticidal soaps, and the nice thing about those, they come with instructions, so it might be a little bit better to use those. The other thing for animal deterrence I've heard, and actually I've used, is using Tabasco sauce to spray on things like lettuce or herbs that rabbits may eat. The only problem with that is it does wash off very quickly, but then you don't want to use that near harvest when you're going to eat it. If they're in seedling stage, sometimes that works. Are there any other organic or trick options like that you've heard of, Pete?
I'm sorry, for what was that again?
To deter rabbits, I've heard people using Tabasco sauce or hot sauce in a sprayed diluted solution for seedlings, not necessary for ones you're going to pick.
Yeah, those things are tough. The repellents sometimes work, sometimes not so much. Wildlife issues are a challenge as a pest. Keep them out, deal with them. We've had several questions about different pests eating the leaves of things, and sometimes we can guess by the crop, but it's usually best to try and properly identify these things. We would want to see a picture so that we can properly identify it and give you the proper control. Either a picture emailed to one of your local extension offices, or later on when our offices are open again, a sample actually would be best so that we can see the damage or the insect or pest.
That's a good point, Pete. For right now, I've been receiving a lot of email pictures from our local county residents, and I imagine your local county Rutgers extension offices too. So please keep sending those in, and like Pete said, sometimes we might ask you for a different shot or different angle. A lot of times with insects, it's best to send us at least the facial portion, the abdomen, and wings if they have it. Just many different angles of that insect we can help identify. And we'll do our best remotely, but once the offices are open, if you would like to send in some samples. Any idea when the offices might be open? It's a question that just popped up. No, we don't know that. We do, in some counties, have staff that are rotating in. but we're not open to the public, and that'll dictate, you know, from the governor's office when we have some issues, as well as Rutgers administration. But our primary concern right now is to make sure we keep our public clientele safe and also our staff safe. And we appreciate all the support, and please utilize Rutgers Cooperative Extension for a lot of your horticultural and pest and plant needs. So thank you. Pete, anything to add?
No, I think that's great. We are open remotely, so again, email us, call helplines and things, and we should be able to address some of your questions.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Sal. Thank you, everyone who participated, and please email us or call us if you have any questions. Someone just asked, where can I see the poll? Unfortunately, the poll timed out, and it's completed already. Sal, you have anything to add to that?
No. Thank you. Amy or Michelle,
Thank you, everyone.
You want to add anything before people sign off?
No, thank you so much. Michelle, thank you so much for the great presentation. It was really excellent. I also wanted to remind people who are still on that we have still many weeks of the Earth Day at Home series. So next week, I can't remember the topic next week. Is it reducing plastic or reducing food waste? I don't remember off the top of my head, but please.
It's food waste. It's me.
Okay, it's Amy Rowe, our Passaic County Environmental Agent, who's going to be with us, talking about how you can reduce food waste at home. So please tell your friends, tell your neighbors to join us at 6:30 next week. I also wanted to remind folks that you can, if you would like to and are feeling generous, donate to the Environmental Stewards Program. These webinars are free. If you go to the Environmental Stewards website, you can donate there to help support this Environmental Stewards Program. And that's it.
All right, thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you,
Great,
Michelle.
thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you, Pete.
Yay.
Very welcome.
The question wrangler.
Do your fingers hurt, Pete?
They do. Hard to keep up.